Hello, everybody, and welcome to a fresh episode of Global Tantrum. I'm Steve. Galen, you're Galen. Happy 4th of July, Galen. Happy birthday, America. God bless.
America. Happy
America.
happy Fourth to you too.
Yeah, you doing anything cool?
I just finished my summer institute, which was a real success, happy to say, but I am exhausted and decided I did not want to interact with lots of people today, so I am just hanging out at my house and enjoying the weather. How about you?
I love that. You're enjoying your right to freedom from others
Yes.
and recording a podcast with me. Yeah, I think we're going to go to a pool party and hopefully not blow off any limbs with fireworks a little bit later.
I
I'm
hope
just
so.
kidding. They are completely illegal in LA County. That's not going to stop probably hundreds of thousands to millions of fireworks going off all over this part of the state. And hopefully no fires will get
I was
started.
about to say, at least it's a low fire risk area.
Exactly.
Uh,
Anyway, it is America's birthday.
and
And
to celebrate, we just passed a disastrous bill through Congress.
yes. Well, so there's two ways to think about that. So sometimes on your birthday, you want to go out and get completely hammered in the club and maybe do some rails and have a great time. And I feel like the big beautiful bill that just passed is kind of along those lines, right? It's like a massive shot in the arm, more debt, fewer taxes, more spending on certain things, right?
And a lot less spending on things like Medicaid and helping out poorer people.
Yeah, they tend not to vote. Like I understand where this is coming from. The point being, though, after that party comes the hangover.
Yeah,
And we talked somewhat recently on this show about debt in America and how that is likely to work. Needless to say that the big beautiful bill is unlikely to help in that regard.
I can't disagree with that. And
Yeah.
I'm hoping it is just a hangover, but some of the longer range fiscal analyses I have seen have me rather worried. And maybe we'll have to readjust our great power draft within a few years, depending on how
Yeah,
things go.
that's right. And speaking of military budgeting, there's been some news around that relevant to our topic this week, which is NATO and the future of NATO.
Yeah, what just happened?
So, President Trump's administration, under the auspices of, I'm not exactly, he's an undersecretary of something. Guy's name is Elbridge Colby, but
Undersecretary of Defense, I think, for policy.
for policy, yeah. He's the administration's main grand strategist, I think. It's the best way to think about him. So he is in the driver's seat when thinking about how to protect America, where to allocate resources. And basically, the administration has announced a 90-day pause on, I believe, all military aid. Aid pause has certainly taken effect in Ukraine. And that is why it is relevant to NATO in
Yeah.
particular.
My understanding is that the declared reason for the pause is that U.S. stocks or U.S. stockpiles, there's a concern they are being drawn to dangerously low levels. I'm no expert on what dangerously low levels look like, but um, since you mentioned Elbridge Colby, he has made very clear that he views the Indo-Pacific and the rise of China as the clear priority that U.S. national security policy should be addressing, and wants to reposition assets to that theater to make it America's top priority. I don't know if this is a justification to pursue a policy that was already sort of in place before. I have read that U.S. stockpiles had been drawn down because the United States has given so much aid to Ukraine since 2022. Frequently with these things, it doesn't have to be one or the other. It could be both, but I suspect those are the main reasons driving this pause.
That's right. And the pause comes more or less around the same time as NATO's big summit, at which NATO, basically the European members of NATO, and also Canada, announced that they would be spending a lot more on defense, which is something that's been a policy goal of the United States for a long time, not just under the Trump administrations, but for quite a while beyond that. The Europeans have been laggards on defense spending. And now they're saying we're going to get to that 2% of GDP mark. We're going to exceed it in some cases. And how has the administration reacted to this news?
Trump famously said last year during the campaign, if one of the members of NATO hadn't reached the previous benchmark of 2% of GDP on defense, he would let Russia do whatever the hell it wanted with that member of the alliance. I think this is a case where Trump, much like academics, I would say, is pretty subject to flattery. Secretary General Mark Rutte, and this bothers me for a whole host of reasons, referred to him as daddy.
That was awesome. Daddy's back and he's pissed.
Yeah. Which Trump seemed very much to enjoy. Look, in the short term, it seems like this has had the desired effect. By 2035, this is a non-binding agreement, by the way, but each member of the alliance is supposed to submit a plan each year that kind of credibly shows, hey, we're on track to get to this point. But by 2035, it's supposed to be 5% of GDP on defense, 3.5% of which is supposed to be, or 3.5% of GDP is supposed to be dedicated to quote unquote pure defense. I think the other 1.5% can go to things like infrastructure that's used to support operations, airfields and bridges, or infrastructure like that can support military operations. But to answer your question, he seems to have come away rather pleased with the situation. Even on a good day, I could not predict whether he would change his mind the next day. Over the long term, I'm not at all convinced that we are not going to see a pretty big shift in U.S. policy nevertheless, but at least for the time being, this seems to have assuaged some of the White House's concerns about NATO free riding.
So the basic picture here is one of the United States shifting its orientation to the East to deal with the rise of China, and in particular, a potential crisis in the Taiwan Strait, which we've talked about in a previous episode.
Yeah.
That leaves the Europeans to step up, which they appear to be doing. So those two things have happened. And then I think last night, basically going into the July 4th holiday, Vladimir Putin's Russia launched its single biggest aerial assault into Ukraine of the entire incursion there, the entire war. So this was also a timely reminder that this war is still on. President Trump's administration has paused the flow of air defenses in particular to Ukraine, those interceptor missiles that they use to stop and protect against those missiles and rockets and drones. So that's pretty serious. President Trump...
It's worth saying that happened right after I think they spoke on the phone.
Exactly. I was going to say, like, he had a phone call with Putin where Putin professed no willingness to come to the table and stop the war. And Trump was like, I don't think he wants to do it, which has been everybody's conclusion since the beginning of the war.
Yeah, I mean, I think there was, at least I was curious to see how the Russians would respond to the peace offer that Trump made basically all the way back in January and has been reiterated, which most analysts thought was pretty favorable to the Russians. But in any case, Putin has indicated that it's not enough and has said what has to happen is that we have to do away with the roots of the conflict, which to me is code for making Ukraine a Russian vassal state. Particularly since the U.S. just did this pause, it does seem like Putin's calculation is, I'm going to keep fighting because I'm more resolved on this than the Americans are. Now, it does seem like the Europeans are willing to do more. They've been seemingly moving in that direction on Ukraine, and this most recent NATO summit, if we at least believe the letter of what was agreed to, looks like they're going to be doing more there. And that seems like a pretty big shift, right?
It does. And in particular, that 3.5% to 5% spending level is, I believe, roughly Cold War levels of spending. And a few NATO members have already gotten there, notably Poland and I think some of the Balkans.
Some of the Baltics, Estonia.
Baltics.
I think Estonia gets there. Yeah. Poland might get there as well.
Yeah, Poland's basically there. So some NATO members, as you'd expect along the eastern flank, are doing this a lot faster than some of the other ones. I think we've mentioned in the past that the center of gravity in NATO, it's like, that's nice. Way to go, guys. And Poland in particular is like a pretty important large economy, right? But they can't anchor a defense all by themselves. They need Germany. They need France. They need the UK, right? And those countries have been a little bit slower to move. And in particular, when it comes to rearmament, those countries have indigenous defense industries, Germany, France, and the UK. And Germany is classically the big one when it comes to armaments manufacturing. So all three countries are pledging to spend more on their defense, but it's taking them some time to ramp up. And I read an interesting analysis recently from Adam Tooze, basically suggesting that the Europeans over time have actually spent a ton of money on collective defense. So close to $9 trillion for the last 15 years. And collectively, like, that's not far off the US's spending at all, actually. But his point is they've gotten way less bang for their buck because that money goes into these individual defense industrial complexes per country. Yep. So they don't have the economies of scale that the Americans do. So it's like the Germans spend on German armaments. The French spend on French armaments. The British spend on British armaments. And yeah, it's like they have defense contractors that can make planes and missiles and tanks and so on, but they're much smaller than, for instance, Northrop Grumman or what's the other one?
Raytheon.
Raytheon, thank you, yeah.
Lockheed Martin.
Lockheed Martin. That means that the Europeans, their spending doesn't go as far and they have less capacity than it looks like they do.
Yeah, there's kind of two elements to it. There's that part, which is just an economies of scale problem and less efficient production of defense equipment. And the second piece is just you're dealing with individual sovereign countries. And so you have coordination problems on things like strategy and pooling of resources. And this is, by the way, is the argument that people that support a robust U.S. role in NATO frequently highlight, which is the U.S. role is seen as kind of indispensable and irreplaceable. And I think that the United States, its military budget alone comprises about 2/3 of all NATO spending. Now, the United States is a global power with commitments all over the world. So obviously not all of that money is going to the European theater. Much of it is going elsewhere. But nevertheless, that's a striking percentage of the alliance's overall expenditures.
Yeah, it's a lot. And a lot of it is spent on American armaments. Now, the Europeans could buy American armaments too, but they don't want to do that because that would leave domestic manufacturers high and dry. And there's domestic political reasons that that's really not a good idea. And these are all democracies in particular. They're not command economies. So they're kind of stuck doing this, at least for the time being. Like in the short term, it would make sense for the Europeans to buy more American stuff and rearm that way. In the longer term, a more integrated European defense industry would probably make sense, but it's not clear how they would get there.
Yeah. Well, so let's stipulate that no one really knows for sure what the future of the U.S. role is going to be in the alliance.
Yeah, that's right.
Look, in the midst of the campaign, this was reported, I think, in Politico. I just assigned it to my class over the summer. The kind of broad outline of what people in the administration, including people like Elbridge Colby, seemed to have in mind was a pretty substantial U.S. drawback from the alliance while maintaining the centrality of the U.S. nuclear deterrent. And that was for a few reasons. One, the U.S. nuclear arsenal really is of such a different size and sophistication than either Britain or France is that doing things like extended deterrence in Eastern Europe becomes much more difficult with just those national nuclear arsenals. And two, because the U.S. doesn't like nuclear proliferation in that part of the world, and then you have to think about the Germans having nuclear weapons. Poland has made rumbling. Those were kind of the big reasons. So stipulating that we don't know if that's the direction the administration is going to go in, because referring to Trump as daddy, appears to have at least bought the Europeans some time here. But if we assume that that is the direction the United States is headed in, call it in the medium to long term, do we think the Europeans are able to provide for their own defense against Russia? That
Yeah.
seems to be, then there's the short-term question of Ukraine and the longer-term question of just European security more broadly.
Yeah. So we're going to do what I believe is a first on this show. I'm going to share my screen. And if you're listening to this on audio, I will talk through it. So we have a summary table here of Russia versus European NATO in 2025 by a bunch of metrics. So active personnel, military aircraft, main battle tanks, naval ships, nuclear warheads, and military spending. And I'm actually going to start from the bottom and look at purely military spending. European NATO, so this is NATO minus the US and Canada, spends about $400 billion a year in dollars. That's nominal dollars in defense spending. And Russia, which is the adversary right now that we're talking about, is at $100 billion. So European NATO should be like, they're spending 4 times more. Why are they so worried about Russia? Also, it looks like they have more active duty personnel. So Russia has 1.3 million versus European NATO's 2 million. Double the military aircraft. Russia's at 5,000 roughly. European NATO's at 10,000. More tanks, more ships, fewer nuclear warheads for sure, but we already talked about that. So you look at this and you're like, what's the problem? There are some problems here that are not revealed by the top line numbers, right, Galen? One of those problems involves just the lack of coordination between European countries in both procurement, right? So they're getting less bang for their buck when it comes to this money, and also in terms of command. Can you talk a little bit about what that would mean on the battlefield?
Yeah, I mean, this is another area where the United States has kind of played the leadership role in the alliance. The supreme allied commander in Europe is always an American. There have been some ideas floated recently about making the SAC year a European for the first time. There's a few things here. I mean, first of all, at a more grand strategic level, if these countries don't have the United States involved as heavily, they might have to spend some resources on defending themselves from one another.
Oh, that's interesting. We'll get back to that.
Okay. Sorry, you asked about command and what was the other part?
Coordination.
Coordination. And
Yeah.
yeah, anytime you're dealing with multiple countries, I mean, first of all, they're gonna disagree on things like threat perception. Spain is going to think about this very differently than Poland does. Italy is going to think about this very differently than Estonia does. And we kind of saw this a little bit at the NATO summit. I think it was Spain that had some objections about the proposed agreement, which makes sense, right?
They're kind of far away from Russia.
Yeah, they are not close to the Russian border, whereas, the Eastern Europeans very much are. You mentioned a bunch of these countries are democracies with indigenous defense manufacturing industries. Like, coordinating what the optimal way to do the comparative advantage of who's producing what in those situations, particularly if they do have to worry about one another, is really, really hard. You can say the same thing about command structures. And so I think I might have mentioned this on the podcast before, but this was the term that we took from that article by Hugo Meyer and Stephen Brooks, that the Europeans face a strategic cacophony. They don't all have uniform interests, and they certainly do not have the ability to pool sovereignty in such a way that they can both procure and command their forces in the most efficient way possible. Whereas Russia is one country and doesn't face that problem. Now they face a whole bunch of other problems. For example, their economy being smaller than Italy's by
And
some
headed into the
metrics.
toilet, by the way.
Yeah. On the other hand, they do have things like they now have some battle-hardened forces.
Yeah,
The
veterans.
The Europeans have not seen combat in a very long time, at least not on a major scale. So I think that points to some of the problems the Europeans have, certainly in the short and maybe medium term and potentially over the long term too.
That's right. Yeah, I think this idea is pretty easy to explain, and it comes in the form of the following riddle. Can 27 7-year-olds beat Mike Tyson? It's like you think about the mass of the 7-year-olds. It's like, yeah, they can get Mike Tyson to the ground and like sit on him. And he probably can't get up. But how are they going to do that?
Can we? So wait, aren't there 30 countries in NATO now?
Yeah, but we're talking about just European NATO, right? So
Oh,
maybe,
okay.
yeah.
No Canada, no US.
So
Okay.
maybe it's 28 countries.
All right, 28 countries.
Yeah. So 28 toddler or 6-year-olds or 7-year-olds or whatever it is I said, right? But that's the basic idea that we're getting at. It's like if you could forge those 28 kids into a team, and each team has a job. Like you have one team that kind of like gets behind Tyson and kneels down, and then another team like pushes him over, and a third team like jumps on him, then that could work, right? But that's the United States' job. The United States is the teacher, basically directing the kids, and the kids listen to the teacher, right? If
Yeah,
instead,
but the US is also not a toddler in this scenario.
correct, the teachers can also fight. The teacher's actually bigger than Mike Tyson.
The US is like Evander Holyfield without getting his ear bitten off.
Exactly. Yeah, he's kind of like standing a little bit further away, maybe. But yeah.
But the question, though, so I pulled up some figures from 1990, and this is only referring to France, Germany, Italy, Spain, the UK, and Poland. And they had more than twice as many men under arms.
Mm-hmm.
So about 2.2 million troops. Let me see if I can find the graphic on tanks. Yeah, I mean, it's not even, yeah, so down from 13,000 main battle tanks down to 1,800 as of 2020. So they have done it in the past.
Yeah.
Alliance theory and, I don't know, basic logic would suggest that if the US is pulling back, European interests are far more engaged than American interests are in something like the Ukraine war and just for European security. Is there not a possibility that they will have the added motivation to overcome these coordination problems?
Yeah, well, one question to ask is if they're able to do it, how long will it take?
Yes.
And it's not going to be immediate. They've got to ramp up. They have to, like, in some cases, reinstate the draft. They got to pay soldiers more. They've got to, I mean, the spending increases have been passed through in many of these countries, but it's not necessarily going to be popular in all cases, right? It's like there may be more jobs to be had, so that's good, but it's like you're taking away from all the stuff that social democracies like to give people. So pension plans, health plans, unemployment insurance, like all of that gets hit by the need to buy bullets, right?
Yeah.
Guns versus butter. It's like we're reorienting towards guns, and that can pose political problems.
Yeah.
And we've talked about in the past, it's like some of these large countries and smaller ones too have powerful right-wing parties that are either in power or next door to gaining power. Some of those right-wing parties are Russophile, in particular the AfD, and I think the National Rally to a certain extent. Or at least they're not as interested in defending against Russia. They don't consider Russia as much of a threat because Russia is also, you know, a conservative power. Cultural orientation now matters a lot more than it used to. It's kind of like a new version of the old ideological divide between communism and capitalism. That's what I would say. It's now left-wing versus right-wing cultural stuff.
I guess I'd ask, like, in referring to Russia as Mike Tyson, are we giving it too much credit?
Yeah, well, so Mike Tyson at his current age, a guy who can put on boxing gloves and was once an extremely powerful puncher, maybe doesn't have the wind, right? Couldn't necessarily beat, was it Jake Paul?
Yeah, I mean, I refuse to pay for that, but I think that's right. And then
yeah, maybe Ukraine is Jake Paul in this in this weird metaphor that I'm putting
not
together.
Bad. I also heard that they kind of like humiliated Tyson when he walked out. Like they pumped up. Yeah, I didn't see it, but they told me that it was like, or I think I heard Jake Paul came out to like all this applause, and then Tyson came out like by himself.
Yeah, that's kind of rough, right? But that's also kind of what you expect for a spectacle like that. This is deadly serious, but the point is, like, Russia's kind of a shadow of its former self militarily.
Well, so if we take that, I mean, we've talked about Russia, Ukraine quite a bit. So, well, maybe we can talk about the implications of this pause in a bit. But in broader terms, do we have a huge problem then, given
Yeah.
the state of Russia's economy, armed forces, and just great power position overall?
People seem to radically disagree on this point. It's a really important question. It's maybe the important question, right? How much of a threat Russia actually poses to Europe? The Americans seem pretty confident that Russia doesn't pose that much of a threat. It may be that the Americans see Russia differently than they used to for the reasons that I discussed earlier around sort of ideological orientation or cultural orientation, because the right wing is in charge in the United States right now as well. And that's a big change, the way all of that has gone down. And
Yeah.
President Trump is a known admirer of Vladimir Putin. That's not a secret, basically, anywhere at this point. So maybe he thinks that Russia
At least for now, he might be getting irritated by his inability to end this war.
He might be getting irritated, but he might also know when to hold them and when to fold them, so to speak. And this might be one campaign promise that he forgets about, given that he's kept some other ones, big ones recently, like the passage of the big, beautiful bill. Maybe that buys him some credit here in terms of like declaring victory and going home. So the Americans, Elbridge Colby, and the rest of the Americans in the administration, they're like, you guys handle this, whether it's a threat or not. We don't think it's that big of a deal. China's the big deal when it, like, for us and for the world. It's the argument that they seem to be making. So we're going to go over there and deal with that. The Europeans, meanwhile, seem genuinely upset and scared of Russia. And again, I think we talked about this in various earlier episodes, including the Great Power episode. Threat is a combination of capability and intent. And Vladimir Putin's Russia has demonstrated malign intent. And you could say that that is in response to NATO expansion.
At least, I mean, in part. By the way, I get like the idea that there's only one cause of this war.
Yes, he certainly didn't need to go to war, but at a minimum, NATO expansion supplied a pretext, and at a maximum, it supplied a real threat, depending on how you think about that. I know how I think about it.
Sure.
But, reasonable people can disagree based on the evidence, and it is more complicated than that. But it's like, yeah, so Russia is, to a certain extent, decrepit and hollowed out by corruption, by demographic decline, and so on. But they do make a lot of missiles. They make a lot of artillery shells. They seem to be able to continue scraping the bottom of the barrel and getting another 5,000 to 10,000 guys every single month into the Ukrainian theater, right? Because they have these vast territories with a bunch of poor people in them, and like they keep paying them. And so it's kind of like they call it like a meat wave attack. But it's like the meat waves are not dying down. Like it's still high tide in the meat sea.
And they've been able to weather these sanctions as well, because mainly countries like China and India continue to do business with them, and much of the sort of the global south too has taken a neutral position. So the sanctions regime is not biting nearly as hard as it would if it were more multilateral. Russia's spending something like 40% of its budget.
It's a lot
on military operations. And so I do think, just based on my general understanding of international relations, that states, and especially large ones like Russia, find ways of continuing to fight wars against long odds because the stakes are high enough. And in a country like Putin's, he's able to mobilize resources, if not efficiently, then brutally. But one still wonders how sustainable this is if we're talking about this becoming, say this war goes on for another 5 years. That would have, I assume, really tremendous consequences on the Russian economy.
It certainly would. And there's some evidence that the economy is like finally starting to fray around the edges because interest rates have been so high. Inflation is still up even though interest rates are really high, that's a really bad sign. It means that the central bank is running out of options. All the, as you said, spending is starting to go to the military and less to consumer discretionary. That's getting squeezed out. So it's like longer term, this could cause extremely serious problems. The operational tempo is really high. But Putin, first of all, has a incentive to seem like he doesn't care about any of that, because that would weaken his position
Yeah.
at the negotiating table, number one. Secondly, it may be the case that he genuinely doesn't care. He may be bluffing, or he may actually just feel that way. Because he's irrational, or he is rational and he thinks this is that important.
You know, like, we haven't seen, I mean, to my knowledge, huge protests, at least in kind of the critical power centers in Moscow.
Hasn't happened.
And he has all sorts of brutal levers he can pull to keep his public in line. And that would not be the first time that has happened in Russian history. So that's kind of the short term piece. Yeah, I guess I actually am not as concerned about the ability of the Europeans to handle this over the long term, given, call it a decade. Now, a lot can happen in a decade, and that's a long time, but I sort of see the logic, at least in the position that people like someone like Elbridge Colby is taking, given that China does seem to be the far bigger issue to deal with if you're the United States. And as I said, if we're going back to like the end of the Cold War, which different time, different place, I understand, like the Europeans have spent more on defense and have had much larger standing armies and far more military equipment at their disposal within our lifetimes. So it's not like it would be unprecedented. It's worth noting, by the way, we forgot to mention at the most recent summit, like everyone, including Trump, did recommit to the Article 5 being, ironclad. So again, we're not even totally sure what's going to happen with US policy, but even in spite of all of the problems you and I have identified when it comes to European command structure and defense contracting and all that and procurement, I do think it's within their means to do it. And one thing we didn't mention is, yes, maybe that figure you showed of European NATO spending being, what was it, 400 billion, and Russia
400 billion.
Yeah. The Eurozone's economy plus the British and whoever else is, in the alliance has vastly more economic resources to draw on than the Russians do. So,
and demographics. Yeah.
yes.
But one question is, and I think this is the important question, one of the most important questions is, will the Europeans, provided that they start to rearm and become more effective in a real way, will they successfully deter Putin's Russia from doing the Baltics next, or getting involved in Transnistria, or any of these other places, right? Where it's like the little green men appear, and like the Russian speakers start to get persecuted, and they just start moving in, like the gray zone warfare that they did in Ukraine, right? In the Donbass and in Crimea. Can they deter that type of action, or will they have to fight?
It's a great point.
And if they have to fight, will they actually fight? That is what I think Putin is asking himself right now.
And if you're, we mentioned kind of the big three European powers. By the way, I don't know, like, we might think about Turkey a bit, but Turkey has interests that are frequently at odds with the rest of NATO, so I'll leave them aside. But
Turkey seems to have opted out of this whole thing. I mean, they're brokering deals between Ukraine and Russia. Or they did a few years ago, but now it's just like they're focused on the Middle East.
But if you could throw them in, they're actually a fairly potent fighting force of their own. And it's a country of, I think, roughly 90 million people. But if we're talking about the UK, France, and Germany primarily, I don't know how big an appetite there is in any of those countries for doing things like pre-positioning thousands of troops in Eastern Europe. And this is a question I have about the whole plan. if it is in fact an accurate reflection of the administration's thinking that the US can just focus on nuclear and ask the Europeans to do conventional defense. One of the reasons that the US has troops in Europe or has in the past is like to credibly show that it is willing to fight a war in Europe if war breaks out. Um, I'm not sure it's as straightforward as to say, all right, we've got the nuclear thing covered. You guys do conventional. I think that's a lot easier said than done, particularly for some of these gray zone tactics and the more exposed parts of the alliance, like in Far Eastern Europe. So I think that's a pretty valid point.
Yeah, I think NATO has adopted new policies to try to do what you're talking about, to try to demonstrate that independent resolve and independent capability. There's new sort of, I think, brigade size forces in the Baltics and in Eastern Europe. And I can share my screen again with a map of this from NATO's website. So you see this map here, right? And you can see that we have a US flag, happy 4th of July, in some of these deployments, right? But we have the UK and Italy here in Romania. So that is one sort of new patrol group. And we have Belgium and France up here in Estonia. And I think Spain, Czech Republic, and Poland and Lithuania. Meanwhile, America is holding down Poland. This is one of the reasons why Poland is rearming, right? This map is from, I think, 2022, a few months after Russia conducted its initial invasion. NATO decided to establish these new patrols and rapid reaction groups along its eastern flank for that reason. Now, after Trump came back, in particular, and started making noises about not wanting to fight with NATO, Poland is not going to have this American flag in stone on its in its patrol, right? So it needs to beef up more than anybody else. So you can kind of see the cause and effect happening as the US withdraws itself potentially from these patrol groups, right? Other flags are going to have to move into these areas. Like Poland might have to do this itself, or the UK or France or Germany is going to have to step into the breach along this sort of eastern flank of NATO.
Yeah, and even as someone who tends to think the Europeans can and should do more and does think that the US has an interest in reprioritizing the Indo-Pacific, I would concede I'm not sure that that can happen without a strong US role for a whole host of reasons, certainly in the short term.
I would agree in the short term. I want to go back to something you said earlier that I think is really interesting and really important, because the Russians are also thinking about this. You said that the European powers, independent of NATO, might need independent capability to protect against one another. Can you elaborate on that? Because this is a super important point.
Look, like this goes back to, if you've studied the early Cold War and like how people were thinking about the defense of Western Europe, one major issue was, if you're France, I'm not totally sure I want to see Germany rearmed.
That was a big deal.
Even leaving aside how the Soviets thought about it, I believe West German rearmament begins in 1955. This is scarcely a decade after the Germans had occupied half of France and turned it into part of the Third Reich. And that was not the First World War involving those two countries. I'd have to go back and look at the figure, but the French casualties in the First World War are staggering,
astronomical,
really just unbelievable in kind of the most horrific types of fighting you can think of. Poland was formerly occupied by Germany. Now, as we've talked about on the show, Germany is a very different country today, but a big piece of what the United States commitment to NATO has done is help to alleviate considerably some of these security dilemmas. The United States is there providing for the defense of the continent in large part. Everyone can kind of relax a little bit in thinking about one another. I have to believe those sorts of concerns will return to the forefront of leaders' minds if there is not a sizable US role on the continent. And that in itself would really degrade NATO's ability to confront Russia, because that obviously would be a large number of resources devoted to other fronts.
That's right. And Russia knows this. And historically, Russia has made efforts to peel off powers from counter Russian European alliances. Sometimes it's Russia and France against Germany. Sometimes it's France and Germany against Russia. Sometimes the UK gets involved. Sometimes it doesn't, right? They're constantly switching sides. Sometimes Russia is a European power. Sometimes it's not. At the moment, it's not, right? But in the past, it has been an important European power, like such as World War II, for instance. We wouldn't have won World War II without Uncle Joe Stalin. Yeah.
Uncle Joe.
Uncle Joe.
You would say Russia is not a European power today?
They don't consider themselves a European power. The new ideology of the day in Russia is Eurasianism.
You're okay.
Right. And it's this idea that Russia is its own thing. It's the leader of Eurasia.
Okay. I was more just thinking they are a power that is involved in European security.
Absolutely.
So, in the same way that the United States is a Pacific power and a Europe. But
ideologically, part of where this whole thing is coming from is this idea that Russia needs to be involved in Europe and in Asia and should have the capacity to do so on its own independent terms, because it's the third Rome and, you know, the leader of the Russian world and all this stuff. This is the party line that appears in Putin's thinking. And he has actually written essays about that I haven't read, but he's got an ideological program. It doesn't make a lot of sense to people outside Russia, but there is an audience for this stuff domestically. And there is like a imperial tradition where Russia is a great power on its own terms, and it sits astride two continents and is able to be a great power in both places.
Okay.
That's the program, right?
Gotcha.
It's not going very well at all.
Yeah. Certainly not on the European front.
Not on the European front. Yeah. But if Russia were able to turn Germany, let's say Russia interferes in the next German election, AfD takes power. We know that the Russians like to meddle in elections. Let's say that they're able to turn Germany or France or the UK to be pro-Russian, and they refuse to participate in Article 5. Maybe they straight up switch sides. That's a big problem if the United States isn't around.
And to your point, like, there are trends already occurring in all of these countries, right? Brexit is almost 10 years ago now. No,
that's right.
That's from the European Union, not from NATO, but it still gives you a sense of where the British public is at when it comes to European affairs. Much of this is uncertain. It's not even clear to me that the US role in NATO is set to change substantially, although I think I would put money on, I don't know how big of a shift it will be. I think things will look rather different by the end of Trump's term in office, but even that is uncertain.
There's a lot of uncertainty. And much of it hinges on European nationalism versus European supranationalism. And the key question to me, this won't be surprising because you know about my research agenda from when I was an academic, is whether Europeans see themselves as Germans, French, British, Polish first, or whether they're capable of seeing themselves as European first.
So, I mean, I'll reiterate the point, and I'm sure someone's going to get upset that I'm like giving the United States credit when the Europeans deserve agency. And I'll just say, I think it's partly both. But I do think that the security role the United States has played in Europe has made it easier for Europeans to prioritize their supranational identities over their strictly national ones. And so if that changes, perhaps we would see a return to them prioritizing strictly national identities, which would have all sorts of downstream consequences.
Yes, it would. Yeah, that would be a return to great power politics in Europe, which we haven't seen since the end of the Cold War, really. But everything's changing in the world. That's why we do this show, and that's why we call it Global Tantrum. And on that note, Galen, do you have anything for Book Corner?
I do not this week.
Okay. I thought you were going to come with our dollar, your problem.
Haven't finished it. I'm about halfway through this. I was busy this week, so I'll get you next week.
All right. And meanwhile, I'll find something else to read too.
Okay.
Should we put a pin in it?
Yeah, let's put a pin in it.
All right, awesome, man. Great discussion as always. And thanks. This has been another episode of Global Tantrum.
Happy 4th.
Happy 4th of July.